hearts with a new song, that we may declare your glory and proclaim your good news of great joy. Amen. Treasure these words and ponder them in your heart. From Psalm 72, verses 10 through 14 in the Message Bible. All kings will fall down and worship, and godless nations sign up to serve God, because God rescues the poor at the first sign of need, the destitute who have run out of luck. A place is opened in God's heart for the down and out. God restores the wretched of the earth. God frees them from tyranny and torture. When they bleed, God bleeds. When they die, God dies.
This morning, our gospel reading is from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 21. Would ask, as you are able, to please stand for the reading of the gospel. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem, in the territory of Judea, during the rule of King Herod, Magi came from the east to Jerusalem. They asked, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We have seen his star in the east, and we have come to honor him." When King Herod heard this, he was troubled, and everyone in Jerusalem was troubled with him. He gathered all the chief priests and the legal experts and asked them where the Christ was to be born. And they said, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what the prophet wrote. You, Bethlehem, land of Judah, by no means are you least among the rulers of Judah, because from you will come one who governs, who will shepherd my people, Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the Magi and found out from them the time when the star had first appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search for the child carefully. And when you found him, report to me so that I may too go and honor him." And when they heard the king, they went, and look, the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stood over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were filled with joy. And they entered the house and saw the child with Mary his mother. And falling to their knees, they honored him. They opened their treasure chest and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Because they were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they went back to their own country by another route. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. Please be seated. Well, indeed, would like to welcome everyone. Cheers to the last day of Christmas. You made it through another Christmas season. So what is it about the 12 days of Christmas? It didn't begin with the Bible story. It actually began in 567 of the Common Era. A church council got together, the Council of Tours. I believe that's in France. And they were the ones who established the 12 days from Christmas to Epiphany as a sacred and festive season, and established the duty of Advent fasting in preparation for that feast. It has also been noted that this was it was done as much for an administrative solution for the Roman Empire as it was done as a faith measure. You see, by this time, the Roman Empire was almost at its greatest extent, and the western half of the Roman Empire followed the solar calendar, the Julian calendar. And the eastern regions of their great and vast empire, well, they followed a lunar calendar. And so this maneuvering of the ecclesiastical calendar really kind of helped get things together in how they celebrated. Because Romans liked continuity. Now, what about us and the 12 days of Christmas? How many of you truly celebrate the 12 days of Christmas? I don't see many hands going up there. For us, it's mostly noted by the Christmas song that we all love to hate, the 12 Days of Christmas. And no, regardless of all those wonderful social media posts that you see that start running rampant, as soon as they start playing all the Christmas carols, there is no hidden religious meaning behind that song whatsoever. None. Zip, zero. It didn't arise at a time when some sort of Christians were persecuted from openly demonstrating their faith. No, that's just a nice story. We think the song came about from a popular children's game, probably in the British Isles. The children's game was called Forfeits, and you would build. You would have successive things that you would have to hear and memorize in order, and then the next person would say it. For us, when does Christmas start? Right after Halloween. Well, that's the Christmas advertising season. The Christmas advertising season is different. We have the Christmas advertising season. Like I said, that's really starting now, Halloween. Look out, here it comes. They make a little space for Thanksgiving. And then the Christmas retail season starts on the Friday after Thanksgiving, of course, with Black Friday, or whatever they call it. Break down the doors Friday. I don't know what they call it. But this year, all of the retailers were just distraught because the fourth Thursday in November was, in the last week. And they hate it when that happens because it seems like there's not very much time between Thanksgiving and Christmas. But for us who call ourselves Christian, if we strictly look at our calendar, we know that the 4 weeks before Christmas are the season of Advent. And then starting on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, we start the 12-day season of Christmastide. So, that's why I'm forgetting all about that. And we are going to look at the story that we read today in Matthew about the arrival, finally, at long last, of the Magi, the wise men, the three kings, which liturgically really doesn't happen until tomorrow, January 6th. But that's okay, we're close enough. Sometimes we do get January 6th that falls on a Sunday, then we really pull out all the stops. But that is why we see, at long last, the three guys with their gifts and one camel gathered around Jesus and Joseph and Mary. That was what our lectionary reading was from. now that we've got all that cleared up, there are several questions that I think we have to look at. First of all, who were these magi? These wise men? These astronomers from the east? We really think that they were priests in Zoroastrianism. Now, believe it or not, that was a monotheistic religion founded by Zoroaster in the 6th century BCE. And it was founded also, it also coincided with some of the earliest religions in Western Iran. How timely is that we are celebrating the arrival of these three guys to visit Jesus and Mary and Joseph, because they saw heavenly portents that led them to think that there was a new king of our Jewish brothers and sisters. You see, Zoroastrianism and Judaism were really the outliers in world religions at the time. Monotheism. Everybody else had a whole pantry full of gods that they worshiped. They were polytheistic. There was a god for this, and there was a god for that, and there was a god for the other things, and there was this minor god and these major gods, and when you were in this city, it had the big temple for so-and-so, and when you were in this other city, this was the temple that they had there dedicated to that god. It was a mess. And I don't make this stuff up. I just read the lectionary and the Bible, and I ask for God's guidance. And so here we are today, gathering at the manger with Iranians to honor the King of the Jews. Second question is this: why would Matthew put this in his story of the nativity of Jesus, and why did Matthew use the strange term? If you read it in Greek, translate it literally from Greek, it would be magoi, which is the plural of magus, when referring to these strange visitors from the east. Why didn't he call them astronomers? Why didn't he call them kings? First of all, they probably weren't kings. Astronomers would have been better. Wise men might be the very best term if we don't refer to the translation of the Greek and call them magi. But the reason Matthew has this is because of readings like we read today in Psalm 72 that states that all kings, that's why we call them kings, will fall down and worship, and all godless nations will sign up to serve God. And this is not a condemnation of the godless heathen nations. This is an understanding that they will be enlightened and they will come to know God. Now, we also know about the Gospels, and we know that each one of those separate Gospels that we have, and the ones that didn't make the cut in our Bible, they were all written with a very specific audience in mind. Who was the audience for the Gospel of Matthew? I've heard people talk about it. Who was it? Jewish Christians. Jewish Christians. People who came into this new faith from Judaism. Luke, most of the people in Luke's congregation were Gentile Christians. They didn't have that Jewish background. And we know this partly because Matthew takes great pains to make sure that he goes back and refers to the great biblical stories and prophecies that point towards the coming Messiah. He does this time and time and time again. That's why Matthew has, just right out of the blocks in his gospel, the genealogy of Jesus that we read in kind of an amusing, humorous way the other day. I held up the signs and we were booing and hissing and clapping and cheering. It's important for Matthew to set that out because in the Jewish tradition, that's the way you were known. I am Daniel, son of Victor, son of Carl, of Kansas. And people say, oh, okay, yeah, I know your family. And sometimes you could go back generation after generation after generation, which is what Matthew did. And the other thing that Matthew does in his genealogy is he starts with Abraham and goes to David, and goes from David to the exile in Babylon, and from that exile goes to Jesus. So it's important that that lineage is strictly through the Jewish bloodlines. When Matthew does his, he starts with Jesus and Joseph and works his way all the way back to Adam. Because Adam was not Jewish. Adam was the first man. And Matthew and Luke wants to make sure that we all understand, the Gentiles understand, that we're all a part of this family tree. Plus, Luke doesn't put that in until the 3rd chapter. It's just not as important to him. And Matthew is always trying to line these things up with the Old Testament prophecies. And many people, many scholars, religious scholars, believe that the main reason for Judaism was to introduce the world to this one God. And here's the other thing that's pretty interesting about this. Judaism really wasn't an organized religion until 500 BC. Sometime in the 500s. These 3 magi, they came from a religion that was not that much younger than Judaism itself. And both of them are still around today, always have been monotheistic religions. Now, Judaism can trace its roots all the way back to the late Bronze Age. Remember, Moses is telling the people, when you enter the land, you are to take some of the first fruits and you are to go to the temple and you're to hold your basket of offerings up to God and you're supposed to say, "A wandering Aramaean was my father." That takes us all the way back, into the Bronze Age, the late Bronze Age. So that they have these 3 wise men coming to visit this child. It's not as far-fetched and out there as we think it might be. I would imagine that those who are monotheistic had a lot of affinity for one another's religions and beliefs. So, let's go on. How about this question? Why did these 3 guys go to Herod? Well, obviously, they weren't very familiar with Roman rule. The Roman Empire, even at its greatest extent, only would have touched Western Iran briefly. So their understanding of Rome, how Rome ruled, how it all worked when Rome moved in and took over your place of inhabitants, they weren't really aware of that. And for these guys, a king was a king. And who better could help guide them to the new king of the Jews than the guy, regardless of how he got this title or job was considered to be the current king of the Jews. The current king should have the inside track on the new king, and so they went to him. The next question is, why did they go back to their own homes a different route? Well, the Bible tells us, Matthew tells us, that they were warned in a dream, and Matthew loves a good dream warning, right? I mean, in the first 2 chapters, we've got 4 dream warnings. 3 of them go right to Joseph, and the other one right to the wise guys. Plus, the Magi were wise. They were wary. They were well versed in the ways of the world. And they probably found it a little bit odd that when they went to Herod and they said, "O King of the Jews, we have been following the star that announces the birth of the new King of the Jews. Where can we find this baby?" And instead of saying, "Oh, well, he's back in the nursery, come on back," Herod says, "Well, hang on, let me get back to you." And he calls all of his advisors to say, "What's going on here? They've got this inside information. Where's this new king of the Jews? This doesn't sound very good for me. Let's find out where this kid's supposed to be." Pressed, they had to come up with an answer, so they went back to the Old Testament prophecies and they said, "Look, here's one. It talks about Bethlehem. Tiny little Bethlehem. Judah, the smallest of the 12 tribes. Oh, but not according to this prophecy. They're going to be great. Because a king is going to come from Bethlehem." Who was the first king of the Jews that came from Bethlehem? Was it Jesus? No. Who do we follow his lineage back to? David. Yeah. David. So they tell that to King Herod, and King Herod wasn't Jewish. Okay? Don't think he was. He was lucky to get that prime spot, and so he played up to the Jewish religion. He didn't know anything about that, so he thought, "Oh, cool, here's a prophecy. This is where it is. Go down to Bethlehem and look for this kid. Hey, when you find him, come back. I want to go down and worship him as well." Here's another good question for us. How many magi were there? How many do we have in front? 3. You know, you can read Matthew up and down. Well, at least those few verses that we read today. It never says there were 3. Magi is plural. We know there was more than one. So why do we always put 3 as the number? Only later were they given names and given backstories, because, you know, we hate to leave something kind of sit like that. How many gifts were there? 3 gifts. Well, if there were 3 gifts, there must have been 3 gifters. The Bible really doesn't tell us that. There could have been, 100 magi who came. This seemed to be pretty important to them, for them to saddle up their camels and travel all this way. How about this one? Were the Magi ever at the stable behind the inn when Jesus was an infant? The quick, short, brutal answer to that is no, they weren't. When we read an accurate reading of Luke, Mary and Joseph were never refused a room at the inn. It's really not there. And so there was no stable that was somewhere behind the inn. However, lose no hope, at least not all, there was indeed a manger. The manger is definitely in Luke, and we have extrapolated a lot from there being a manger. We can learn more about that next Christmas. How's that? Shall we gather it again and see if we can really learn this story straight? In Matthew, what they say, and we just read it, these magi, however many there were, they showed up at the house in Bethlehem because for Matthew, that's where Mary and Joseph were living at the time. They were from Bethlehem. That was where their home was. And so the Magi showed up at their house. And when they showed up at the house, they went in to greet Mary and the child. Now this is interesting. The word child is the more generic term for a young person of an indeterminate age. I think that if Matthew wanted to really relate that it was a baby or an infant, I think he could have chosen those terms. I don't think that was the case. When we continue reading this story, and we read that last week, Herod, when he found out that he had been tricked by the Magi, they went back to their home a different route. He sent out his official greeters of this new king of the Jews, not to worship, but to kill him. And he said, let's not take any chances. Anybody down in Bethlehem who has a male child that is 2 years old or younger, just get rid of him. I think that when they got to the house, they greeted a little toddler, a 2-year-old, the terrible twos. And that's when they realized, oh, we've made a horrible mistake in the gifts we've brung. Jesus played with the boxes, of course. And when we take all these things together and we look at them, maybe we're not really sure anymore about this story. But Matthew, in the first 2 chapters, really spells out very nicely this story about the birth of Jesus. He understands, because the scriptures tell us that this Messiah is going to be called a Nazarene, that he has to get Mary, Joseph, and Jesus up to Nazareth somehow, and he does. After Herod dies, Jesus saddles the family up and they head back towards Bethlehem. But once again, a dream warning from Matthew, one of his favorites, says, don't stop in Bethlehem, go someplace different. And that's how they end up in Nazareth, because that fulfilled the prophecies. But Matthew tells us how this birth came about, where the family was living, who outside of the family came to visit, and it was just the Magi, no shepherds, no heavenly chorus of angels, why they had to become refugees, why they ended up in Nazareth. It's an amazing story. And we need, I think, to appreciate both stories that we have about the birth of Christ. I think they stand amazingly well on their own. And I think they can teach us much more separately than they can when we kind of mash them all up together. And we wind up with Jesus and Mary and Joseph and shepherds and animals and angels and magi and camels and Santa Claus and Rudolph all clustered around the manger in a stable. I think that gets confusing. So here's what I'm going to challenge you to do. Go home today and read just the first 2 chapters of Matthew and take that story in and follow all of the footnotes. Find out where the prophecies were that they talk about. And then tomorrow or Tuesday or Wednesday or maybe even next Friday, sit down and read the first 2 chapters of Luke and take in a whole different story of Jesus' birth. Lay aside all of the folklore that surrounds this amazing story. Read them mindfully, read them prayerfully, and find where following Christ might lead you. Hallelujah and amen. We've got an interesting Christmas hymn here, number 140.